Hidden in the Persian Gulf, just a few kilometers off the coast of Iran, lies a small island most people have never heard of. It's not a major city. There are no skyscrapers, no massive population. Only a few thousand people live there. And yet, this tiny island quietly controls the economic lifeline of an entire country. Nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports pass through this single location. Billions of dollars move through it every year. Global energy markets watch it closely. And in moments of conflict, this small island has the power to influence oil prices across the entire world. Welcome to Kharg Island, the hidden engine behind Iran's oil empire. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, about 25 to 30 kilometers off Iran's mainland coast. On a map, it looks almost insignificant. The island covers only around 20 square kilometers, smaller than many cities around the world. Its population is modest, only around 8,000 residents call it home. At first glance, nothing about it suggests global importance. No massive skyline, no financial district, no global corporations headquartered there. But beneath this quiet surface lies one of the most important pieces of energy infrastructure in the Middle East. Kharg Island is home to Iran's primary oil export terminal. This is where crude oil from across the country is gathered, stored, and shipped to global markets. Across the island, enormous storage tanks hold millions of barrels of crude oil. Pipelines stretch across the landscape, and long industrial jetties extend into the Persian Gulf, where massive oil tankers dock every day. Some of these ships are among the largest vessels ever built. Supertankers capable of carrying 2 million barrels of oil in a single voyage. They arrive empty and leave carrying fuel that will power economies thousands of kilometers away. But what makes Kharg Island so important is something surprisingly simple: geography. Much of Iran's coastline along the Persian Gulf is shallow. Large oil tankers struggle to dock safely in those waters. But Kharg Island sits near naturally deep water, allowing very large vessels to anchor directly at the export terminals. That natural advantage turned the island into the perfect gateway for Iran's oil exports. From here, oil can be loaded quickly, efficiently, and at massive scale. At peak capacity, the island's facilities can load multiple supertankers simultaneously. Every day, pipelines deliver crude oil from fields across Iran directly to this small island. From there, the oil begins its journey across the world. At times, nearly 950 million barrels of oil per year have passed through Kharg Island. That makes this tiny island one of the most strategically important energy hubs on Earth. And yet, most people have never even heard its name. But Kharg Island wasn't always the center of Iran's oil trade. For centuries, it was simply a quiet island in the Persian Gulf. Fishing boats passed nearby, small communities lived along its shores, and the island played only a minor role in regional trade. Everything changed in the 1960s. At the time, Iran was dramatically expanding its oil production. New oil fields were being developed across the country. Fields like Ahvaz, Marun, and Gaksaran were producing enormous volumes of crude oil. Production was rising rapidly. But Iran faced a major logistical problem. Exporting oil at global scale requires massive infrastructure. You need pipelines, storage facilities, loading terminals, and most importantly, deep water ports capable of handling giant tankers. Many of Iran's mainland ports simply weren't suitable. They were too shallow, too crowded, or poorly positioned for large-scale export operations. Kharg Island solved all of those problems at once. Its deep surrounding waters allowed supertankers to dock safely. Its offshore position made it easier to manage large shipping traffic. And its location in the Persian Gulf placed it directly on the path of major global shipping routes. Soon, Iran began transforming the island. Pipelines were constructed, linking oil fields on the mainland directly to Kharg. Massive storage tanks were built across the island's surface. Loading terminals extended far into the sea. Within a few years, Kharg Island had become the central hub of Iran's oil export system. By the 1970s, the transformation was complete. Supertankers arrived almost daily. Oil flowed through pipelines into giant terminals. And from there, it was shipped to energy markets around the world. Iran's oil economy had found its beating heart. To understand why Kharg Island matters so much today, you need to understand how important oil is to Iran's economy. For decades, oil exports have generated a major portion of the country's foreign income. That revenue funds critical parts of the national budget, government spending, infrastructure development, public subsidies, military expenditures. In many ways, oil exports are the financial backbone of the Iranian state. And the majority of those exports pass through one single place, Kharg Island. Because of that concentration, analysts often describe the island using a striking phrase. They call it a single point of vulnerability. Because if the flow of oil through Kharg Island stopped, Iran's export income could collapse almost overnight. Think about the scale of that dependence. One small island, one oil terminal, one export route, supporting the economy of more than 80 million people. That's why some energy analysts describe Kharg Island as the jugular of Iran's oil industry. And because of that importance, the island has repeatedly become a target during times of conflict. One of the most dramatic examples occurred during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. This was one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in the modern Middle East. Both countries depended heavily on oil exports to fund their war efforts. And that made energy infrastructure a strategic target. During the conflict, Iraq launched repeated airstrikes against Kharg Island. The objective was simple: destroy Iran's export facilities and cripple its ability to sell oil to the world. This phase of the conflict became known as the Tanker War. Oil terminals, tankers, and shipping routes across the Persian Gulf were attacked. Missiles struck infrastructure, naval mines threatened shipping lanes, and Kharg Island itself became a major battlefield in this economic war. Bombing raids damaged pipelines, storage tanks caught fire, loading terminals were destroyed. For a time, it appeared that Iran's oil exports might be completely shut down. But Iran responded quickly. Engineers worked around the clock to repair damaged facilities. Temporary loading systems were built, pipelines were restored, and within a few years, Kharg Island was once again exporting oil. The war demonstrated something very important. Kharg Island was simply too important to abandon. Today, decades later, the island remains the central artery of Iran's oil exports. Modern infrastructure now allows Kharg Island to store around 30 million barrels of crude oil at a time. One of the largest buyers today is China. Despite international sanctions, Chinese refiners import large volumes of Iranian crude. That trade generates billions of dollars in revenue every year. And once again, most of that oil passes through Kharg Island. Even under heavy economic sanctions, Iran has continued exporting over 1 million barrels of oil per day in recent years. That represents enormous financial flows, billions of dollars moving through a single island in the Persian Gulf. Any disruption there could trigger global consequences. If exports from the island were suddenly interrupted, millions of barrels per day could disappear from the global oil supply. And oil markets react extremely quickly to supply disruptions. Prices could rise sharply. Energy traders would scramble to secure supply, and the ripple effects could spread across the global economy. Higher oil prices increase transportation costs. Fuel becomes more expensive. Manufacturing costs rise. Inflation can increase across multiple sectors. Even countries thousands of kilometers away can feel the impact. That's why Kharg Island is not just important to Iran, it is important to global energy stability. Without it, Iran's oil exports would collapse. Without those exports, the country's economy would face enormous pressure. And because oil remains one of the most important commodities on Earth, what happens on this small island can influence energy markets around the globe. Kharg Island, the tiny island that powers Iran's economy. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives like this.